The boy came through the door already running. Grace Calloway looked up from the coffee machine just in time to catch him before he slammed into the counter. He was small for 7, maybe 8, with a coat too big for his shoulders and eyes that kept jumping to the window every few seconds like he expected the glass to break. "Whoa. Hey, slow down, buddy." She caught his arm gently. "Where's the fire?" He didn't answer. He never answered right away. She'd learned that about him weeks ago. The first Thursday he showed up alone in the booth by the window, ordering the same grilled cheese and fries in a voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator case. What she noticed now, though, was new. His knuckles were white around the strap of his backpack. Outside, a black car sat at the curb with its engine running, headlights off, like it was trying not to be seen and failing completely. "Is someone chasing you?" Grace asked, crouching so she was at his eye level. The boy shook his head. Too fast, too hard. "Noah." She said his name the way you'd say it to a spooked animal, low and even. "You can tell me." He glanced at the window one more time, then at the door, then finally at her, and something in his face cracked open just a little. "The man in the car isn't Sal," he whispered. "Sal always drives me. This isn't Sal." Grace felt the floor tilt under her, just slightly, the particular vertigo of understanding that something ordinary has quietly become something else. She had worked the evening shift at Bell's Diner for 3 years. She knew the rhythm of it the way she knew her own heartbeat. The bell over the door, the hiss of the grill, the parade of regulars who came in tired and left a little less so. Old Pete with his crossword and his complaints about the coffee. The 2 mechanics from the shop down the road who ate free pie on Fridays because Nadia, who owned the place, had a soft spot for grease-stained hands. And then there was Noah, who arrived every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, always alone, always quiet, always watched from a distance by a car that never came inside. She had never asked who his family was. There were places in this town where questions like that didn't stay simple for long, and something about the stillness around this particular boy told her his corner of the world was one of them. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the 7-year-old standing in front of her, shaking, telling her that the man who was supposed to keep him safe wasn't the man waiting outside anymore. "Okay," Grace said, standing up slowly, keeping her voice light for his sake, even as her pulse climbed. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to sit at the counter, right where I can see you, and you're going to have the biggest milkshake I've ever made, and I'm going to make a phone call. Does that sound all right?" Noah nodded, small and fast, and let her guide him onto the stool nearest the register, as far from the window as the room allowed. She poured chocolate syrup with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and reached for the phone bolted to the wall behind the counter, the one Nadia used to call in orders to the butcher. She didn't know the number for whoever Sal was. She didn't know the number for whoever Noah's father was. All she had was a business card tucked in the tip jar from 3 weeks ago, left there without explanation by a man in an expensive coat who had walked in once, sat across from his son without saying much, and left $100 under his coffee cup on his way out. She had never called the number on that card. She had told herself she never would. Her fingers found it anyway, tucked behind the sugar packets, and she dialed before she let herself think too hard about what she was doing. It rang twice. Yes, a man's voice, flat, alert, already sounding like he expected bad news before she said a word. "This is Grace, from the diner, Bell's, on Ferris Street. Noah's here. He's safe, he's fine. But he says the driver outside isn't Sal. He's scared, and there's a car parked out front with its lights off, and I don't like the look of it." There was a silence on the other end that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Lock the door," the voice said. "Lights on inside. Blinds down. Do not go outside for any reason. I am 11 minutes away." The line went dead before she could ask who she'd just been speaking to, though some cold, certain part of her already knew. Grace hung up the phone and turned the deadbolt on the diner's front door with hands that had gone strangely calm, the way hands sometimes do when the body decides panic is a luxury it cannot afford right now. She pulled the blinds down over the window by Noah's usual booth and flipped on every light switch behind the counter until the whole diner glowed like an island. "Is my dad coming?" Noah asked, watching her with the milkshake untouched in front of him. "Someone's coming," Grace said, "and I have a feeling, whoever it is, that car outside is going to wish it had parked somewhere else." Noah almost smiled at that. Almost. She sat down on the stool beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she kept talking, the way you talk to someone standing at the edge of something high. Not about the height, never about the height, just about anything else at all. She asked him what his favorite cartoon was. She asked him if fries were better with ketchup or without, a question she already knew the answer to, because she'd watched him drown his in it every single Thursday for 2 months. She asked him about school, about the kid in his class who apparently ate paste, a detail that made him laugh despite everything, a short, surprised bark of a laugh that seemed to catch him off guard as much as it did her. Outside, the black car hadn't moved. Its engine idled low and patient, and twice Grace caught a shapeshift behind the wheel, a shoulder turning toward the diner window like it was watching them right back. She kept the boy talking. She kept herself between him and the glass without making it look like that was what she was doing. 6 minutes. 9 minutes. At 11 minutes exactly, headlights swept across the blinds, throwing thin white bars of light across the ceiling, and Grace heard tires on gravel, sharp and controlled, the sound of a car that had been driven fast and stopped hard on purpose. She heard 2 doors open, not one. She stood, instinctively placing herself in front of Noah's stool, her heart suddenly loud enough that she could hear it in her own ears. The diner door didn't open right away. There were voices outside first, low, clipped, unmistakably tense, though she couldn't make out the words through the glass and the blinds. Then the black car that had been idling at the curb pulled away fast, tires chirping against the pavement, taillights shrinking into the dark like something that had thought better of whatever it came to do. The bell over the door rang. A man stepped inside, tall, dark coat, the kind of stillness in his shoulders that didn't come from calm but from control, from the particular discipline of someone who had trained his body not to show what he was feeling. Grace recognized him immediately as the man from the business card, the man who had sat across from his son weeks ago without a word and left $100 under his coffee cup. His eyes went straight past her, straight to the boy on the stool, and for one raw, unguarded second every ounce of that control dropped away, and there was nothing on his face but fear, and then relief, and then something that looked almost like grief for a version of tonight that hadn't happened. "Dad," Noah said, and slid off the stool and ran to him the way he had never once run to Grace, arms out, face pressed into the dark coat. The man knelt and wrapped both arms around his son like he was trying to fold the boy back inside himself, and for a moment he said nothing at all, just breathed, one hand pressed flat against the back of Noah's head. Then he looked up at Grace over his son's shoulder, and his eyes were not the eyes of a man who ran a shipping company, whatever the sign on his office door might say. "You called me," he said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't know who else to call. You locked the door. You kept the lights on. You kept him talking. His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded, strangely, like the beginning of a debt he intended to repay. You did exactly the right thing." Behind him, a second man had come in, broader, older, breathing hard, like he'd run the last stretch on foot. He looked at the empty curb where the black car had been and swore under his breath, low and furious, before catching himself in front of the boy. "Sal," Noah said, turning at the sound of the second man's voice, and something in the boy's shoulders loosened at last, the tension of the last 20 minutes finally allowed to leave his small body. "I'm here, kiddo," Sal said, though his eyes were on his employer, and some silent, grim conversation passed between the 2 grown men that Grace understood she was not meant to be part of. The man in the dark coat straightened, keeping one hand on his son's shoulder, and turned fully to face her for the first time. "My name is Victor," he said. "Victor Marchetti." Grace had heard the name before, whispered in the diner in the hours after closing, wrapped in rumors she had never let herself fully believe, because believing them meant looking at the boy in the window booth differently, and she had not wanted to do that. She had not wanted the boy's fries, and his terrible jokes, and his rare, hard-won smiles to belong to someone she was supposed to be afraid of. "I know who you are," she said carefully. "Then you know I don't say thank you often." Victor's gaze didn't waver. "But I'm saying it now. Whatever tonight was, whoever that was outside my son's usual ride, you stood in front of him without knowing what you were standing in front of. That matters to me more than you understand." "He's a kid," Grace said simply. "Scared kid, safe diner, locked door." It wasn't complicated. Something shifted behind Victor's eyes, some calculation she couldn't follow, and then he nodded once, slow, like he was filing that answer away somewhere important. "It's going to get more complicated," he said, "starting tonight." Outside, far off, a siren rose and then faded again into the ordinary hum of the night, and Grace realized with a small cold drop in her stomach that whatever had almost happened in the front seat of that black car was not finished. It had only been postponed. Nadia arrived at the diner just after midnight, pulled out of bed by a phone call from Grace that started with "everything's fine" and ended with Nadia driving over anyway, still in her slippers, refusing to believe the first part until she'd seen it with her own eyes. She found her diner locked, lit up like a lighthouse, and full of men in dark coats standing near the door with their hands folded in front of them, doing absolutely nothing and somehow filling the whole room with the sense that something enormous had almost happened here. "I want an explanation," Nadia said, to nobody in particular, and everybody in the room turned to look at Victor Marchetti instead of answering her themselves. Grace gave her the short version once the men outside had cleared the lot and Victor had taken Noah into the back office to call someone about school arrangements for the morning. A car, not Sal, a boy who knew the difference before any adult did, a phone call to a number she'd never used before tonight. Nadia listened with her arms crossed, her jaw tight, and when Grace finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. "You know who that man is," Nadia said finally. "I do now. And you're not scared?" Grace thought about it honestly before answering, because the question deserved an honest answer. "I'm scared of the wrong things happening to that kid," she said. "I don't know if I'm scared of his father yet. Ask me again in a week." Nadia didn't look reassured, but she didn't argue either. She'd owned this diner for 11 years, long enough to know that some questions in this neighborhood were better left where they lay, sleeping and undisturbed, and that pulling on the wrong thread could unravel more than you meant to unravel. Victor came out of the back office a few minutes later, phone gone, tie loosened, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in the last hour. Noah trailed behind him, wrapped now in a blanket someone must have pulled from the trunk of the second car, half asleep on his feet, but refusing, Grace could tell, to let go of his father's sleeve. "I owe you both an explanation," Victor said, addressing Nadia directly this time, with the careful formality of a man who understood the etiquette of trespassing into someone else's business. "And I owe you compensation for tonight. For the lock you'll want changed. For the peace of mind you'll want restored." "I don't want your money," Nadia said, in the tone of someone who had clearly decided this in the 11 minutes it took her to drive over. "I didn't think you would." Victor's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'll offer it anyway, because refusing it wouldn't be honest either. But that's not what I came back to say." He looked at Grace. "Someone tried to take my son tonight," he said flat, unadorned, the words landing in the room like stones dropped into still water. "Not scare him. Not send a message. Take him. The man in that car was driving a vehicle that matched mine down to the plate, close enough that in bad light, at a glance, my own son almost got into it." The room went very quiet. "Why?" Grace asked. "Because someone had to, and it seemed nobody else was going to." Victor was silent for long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer at all. Then he glanced down at Noah, who had finally lost the battle with sleep, and slumped against Sal's side on the nearest stool, and something in Victor's face closed over like a door. "Because I run something that other men want to run instead," he said, "and they've learned that hurting me directly costs them too much. My son costs them nothing, and it costs me everything." He said it without drama, without the practiced menace Grace had half expected from a man with his reputation. He said it the way you'd describe a fact of weather, a thing that simply was, that he had long since stopped being surprised by, and had never stopped hating. "He can't keep coming here alone," Grace said, before she could stop herself. "No," Victor agreed, "he can't." Noah stirred at that, some half-conscious protest rising through the fog of exhaustion. "But I like it here," he mumbled, eyes still closed. "Grace does the dance thing." Victor's eyes came up to meet hers again, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, not just the careful arithmetic of a dangerous man assessing a variable he hadn't accounted for, but something closer to curiosity, the look of a person encountering an old memory in an unexpected place. "The dance thing," he repeated quietly. "The jukebox," Grace said, feeling suddenly exposed, like she'd been caught doing something more intimate than she'd realized. "Slow nights. He gets bored in that booth by himself. I taught him some terrible moves a few weeks back, and he hasn't let me live it down since." "He hasn't danced with anyone since his mother left," Victor said, and then seemed almost startled that he'd said it out loud, that the sentence had escaped somewhere private and landed in a diner at midnight in front of a waitress he'd known for exactly one conversation and one crisis. Nobody said anything. Sal, over by the window, suddenly found something fascinating to look at in the parking lot. Victor cleared his throat and gathered himself back into the composed shape he'd walked in wearing. "I'll need to increase security around his routine," he said. "Business again, the crack sealed back over. But I don't want to take away the one place he's been happy in longer than I can remember. I'd like to propose an arrangement, if you're willing to hear it." "I'm listening," Grace said. "Sal will drive him, as before, but there will be a second car now, unmarked, following at a distance. If Noah wants to keep coming here, he'll come here, but the arrangement changes on my end, not yours. You continue exactly as you have been. Nothing about how you treat him should change because of what you learned tonight." "That's not really a hard thing to agree to," Grace said. "I wasn't planning on changing anything. Most people would." Victor said it simply, without flattery, like an observation rather than a compliment, and somehow that made it land harder than if he'd tried to charm her with it. "Most people, once they learn what I am, decide the safest thing is distance. I don't blame them for it. It is generally the correct decision." "I don't know what the correct decision is," Grace admitted. "I know a scared kid asked me for a milkshake tonight, and I know I'd do the exact same thing tomorrow if he needed it." Something passed over Victor's face then, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it, and he nodded once, the same economical nod he'd given her earlier, filing something else away. They didn't discuss it further that night. Sal carried a mostly asleep Noah out to the second car, the one that had actually belonged to them all along, and Victor lingered by the door a moment longer than necessary, looking at Grace with an expression she would turn over in her mind for days afterward, unable to fully name it. "Lock this door behind us," he said. "And Grace, thank you. Twice, now, in one conversation. I don't expect that to become a habit." Then he was gone, and the diner was quiet again, and Nadia was staring at her with an expression somewhere between worry and something that might have been reluctant respect. "You just made yourself very important to a very dangerous man," Nadia said. "I made myself important to his kid," Grace corrected. "The dangerous man part is just something that comes attached to it." She went home that night unable to sleep, replaying the sound of Noah's voice saying the man in the car isn't Sal, replaying the look on Victor Marchetti's face when he'd knelt in front of his son and held him like the world had almost ended. She thought about the rumors she'd heard over the years, the shipping company that moved more than shipping companies were supposed to move, the disputes that got settled in rooms nobody talked about afterward, the wife who had left 2 years ago and never been seen in this town again. None of it matched the man who had said he was thanking her twice and did not expect that to become a habit, like gratitude itself was a currency he had to ration carefully. The next Tuesday, Noah came in exactly on schedule, Sal at the wheel, a second unmarked car idling a block down the street where Grace could just make it out from the window if she looked hard enough. Noah slid into his usual booth, ordered his usual grilled cheese, and looked up at her with the particular brightness of a kid who has decided, against considerable evidence, that the world is still basically a safe place. "Did you miss me?" he asked. "Desperately," Grace said, deadpan, and he laughed the same short, surprised laugh from before, like joy still caught him off guard sometimes, like he was still relearning how it worked. She noticed, over the following weeks, that Victor himself started coming inside more often, instead of waiting in whichever car he arrived in. He never stayed long. He never explained his schedule, never announced himself, simply appeared some Tuesdays and not others, sitting across from his son with a cup of coffee he mostly let go cold while he watched Noah eat, watched Grace refill water glasses, watched the ordinary rhythm of a diner at dinner hour like it was something rare and worth studying. She learned small things about him in fragments, the way you learn a person you're not sure you're allowed to be curious about. That he took his coffee black and never finished it. That he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever Noah mentioned his mother, a flinch so small most people would have missed it entirely, but Grace had spent 3 years reading the smallest signals off the faces of tired strangers, and she caught it every time. That he had a way of positioning himself in any room so he could see both the door and his son at once, a habit so deeply worn into him it looked less like caution and more like breathing. She learned, too, that the neighborhood had a great deal to say about Victor Marchetti, none of it kind, all of it delivered in the hushed voice people use for things they're afraid might be listening. The shipping company on the east side that moved things the manifests didn't mention. The men who disappeared from conversation the way certain names disappear from news cycles, quietly, permanently, without anyone quite explaining how. The wife, Elena, gone 2 years now, and the 2 competing rumors about why, that she'd left him, or that leaving had never actually been her choice. Grace didn't know which rumor to believe, if either. She only knew what she saw in front of her, a boy who lit up at the sound of a jukebox and went quiet at the mention of his mother, and a father who watched his son like he was terrified of losing something twice. She was starting to understand that in this particular story, those 2 facts were connected by something none of the whispers downtown had quite gotten right. The detective came in on a Wednesday, which was already wrong, because Wednesdays belonged to nobody in particular. No regulars, no rhythm, just the slow gray hours between lunch and dinner, when Grace usually caught up on refilling ketchup bottles and wiping down the counter twice, for no reason except that the diner was quiet enough to make her hands restless. He sat at the far end of the counter, ordered black coffee, and didn't open the newspaper he'd brought with him. That was the detail that told her something was off before he ever said a word. People who brought newspapers into diners read them. He just set his down flat and looked at her. "Frank Doyle," he said, sliding a badge across the counter without being asked. "Got a few questions, if you've got a few minutes." Grace glanced toward the kitchen window, where Nadia was doing something to a pot that didn't need doing, clearly listening. "About what?" "About the car that pulled up outside your diner a few weeks back. The one that left in a hurry." Doyle turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a small, precise motion, like a man used to giving himself something to do with his hands, while he watched a person's face for the truth. "Plates came back registered to a company that dissolved 8 months ago. That's the kind of car nobody drives unless they don't want to be found afterward." "I didn't get the plates," Grace said honestly. "I was a little busy keeping a kid calm, the kid being Noah Marchetti." She didn't answer that, and Doyle didn't seem to expect her to. He took a slow sip of his coffee instead, giving the silence room to sit there uncomfortably between them. "I'm not here to make trouble for you," he said eventually. "I've had my eye on Victor Marchetti's operation for longer than you've probably worked here. I know what he is. I also know he's never once put a civilian in the ground. which is more than I can say for the man who's been trying to take over his territory for the last year and a half. Korshak, Grace said, before she could stop herself, because she had heard the name whispered enough times by now to recognize it when it finally showed up in daylight. Doyle's eyebrows went up slightly, some small reassessment happening behind his eyes. You've been paying attention. I work in a diner. People talk over pie. Anton Korshak's been trying to push into Marchetti's shipping routes since last spring, Doyle said. Direct approaches haven't worked. Marchetti's men are loyal, and Marchetti himself doesn't scare easy. So somebody decided the boy was a softer target than the father. He watched her carefully. The car that pulled up outside your diner wasn't the first attempt. It was just the first one that almost worked. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach, the particular chill of learning that a thing she'd thought was a single frightening night was instead one beat in a longer, uglier rhythm she hadn't been allowed to hear before now. How many times? She asked. 3, that we know of. 2 before yours, both caught early by Marchetti's own people before they got anywhere near the boy. Yours was the closest anyone's come. Why is nobody arresting anybody? Grace said, sharper than she meant to, frustration bleeding through before she could catch it. Because nobody's talking, Doyle said, without offense, like the question was fair and the answer was simply the shape of the world he worked in. Marchetti won't file a report because filing a report means inviting my department into a business he'd rather keep dark. Korshak's people are too smart to leave anything behind that would stand up in a courtroom, and civilians who get close enough to see something useful usually decide, very sensibly, that they'd rather not remember what they saw. Are you asking me to remember something? I'm asking you to be careful, Doyle said, and for the first time something in his flat professional tone cracked just slightly into something that sounded almost like concern. You're a waitress who got pulled into the middle of a war between 2 men who don't care who's standing in the crossfire as long as it isn't them. Marchetti will protect that boy with everything he has, and probably you too, now that you're tangled up in it. But protection from a man like that comes with strings, and I don't think you understand yet how long those strings are. Grace didn't answer right away. She thought about Noah's laugh, the short, surprised bark of it, still catching him off guard weeks later. She thought about Victor's flinch at the mention of his wife's name, the careful way he positioned himself in every room to watch both the door and his son. I understand more than you think, she said finally. Doyle studied her for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and set a card on the counter beside his untouched newspaper. Plain, no department seal, just a name and a number. If anything changes, if you see anything, hear anything, feel anything that makes the hair go up on the back of your neck, that number reaches me directly, day or night. You think something's coming. I think Korshak doesn't stop just because one attempt failed, Doyle said, standing, dropping bills on the counter that covered the coffee twice over. Men like him don't lose interest. They recalculate. He left without finishing the coffee, and Grace stood there for a long moment after the bell over the door had stopped ringing, staring at the plain white card with a phone number on it, feeling the walls of her ordinary life quietly rearranging themselves around a shape she hadn't agreed to but couldn't seem to step out of either. Nadia came out from the kitchen once he was gone, wiping her hands on her apron, her face tight. That was a cop, Nadia said. That was a cop. Asking about the Marchetti boy. Asking about all of it. Grace slid the newspaper Doyle had left behind toward her, the one he'd never opened, and something about its blankness bothered her more than words would have. There's been more than one attempt, Nadia, before ours. The car that showed up here wasn't the first time someone tried to get to Noah. Nadia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its usual brisk certainty. I've run this diner for 11 years, she said. I've never once had trouble walk through that door that didn't eventually walk right back out again. I don't like the feeling that this might be different. It might be, Grace admitted. Then why are you still smiling every time that boy walks in? Grace didn't have a clean answer for that, not one she could hand over easily, so she just shrugged, and Nadia, who had known her long enough to recognize when a question deserved to be left alone, let it drop. Victor came in that evening without Noah, which almost never happened, arriving instead with Sal a half-step behind him and a tightness around his eyes that Grace had learned, over the past weeks, to read as trouble. He sat at the counter rather than a booth, close to where she was working, and waited until the diner's few remaining customers had cleared out before he spoke. "A detective came to see you today," he said. "Not a question. Word travels fast." In this neighborhood, everything travels fast. That's the problem with it. Victor's jaw was tight. What did he tell you? Grace considered lying, considered softening it, and decided against both. That there've been 2 other attempts on Noah before the one at my diner. That a man named Anton Korshak has been trying to take your territory for over a year and decided your son was easier to reach than you are. Something flickered across Victor's face, brief and dark, gone before it could settle into any expression she could name. Doyle shouldn't have told you that. Why not? It's true, isn't it? Because now you're carrying weight you didn't ask to carry, Victor said, and there was an edge in his voice now, not aimed at her, aimed inward, at himself. I told you I'd increase security. I told you nothing about your life needed to change. That was a promise I made in good faith, and a police detective just walked in here and unmade half of it in one conversation. I'm not made of glass, Victor. His name felt strange and deliberate in her mouth, the first time she'd used it, instead of some more careful, distant phrasing. I've known for weeks that whatever's happening around your son is bigger and older than one bad car outside my window. I didn't need Doyle to tell me that. I needed him to tell me how big. Victor was quiet, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, the same small, precise gesture Doyle had made hours earlier, and Grace wondered whether that was a habit men in this kind of tension all eventually developed, something to occupy the hands while the rest of them stayed dangerously still. Korshak doesn't care about my son, Victor said finally, low, controlled, the words coming out like they cost him something to say aloud. Not as a person, he cares about him as leverage. If he takes Noah, he doesn't have to fight me for my routes, my contracts, my people. I fold. Any father would fold. That's the calculation, and it's not wrong. So what happens now? Now I make sure the calculation stops being possible. Victor's eyes came up to meet hers, and there was something bleak in them, something that looked almost like an apology arriving early, for a request he hadn't made yet. I'm going to ask you something, Grace, and I need you to understand. You can say no. I would understand completely if you said no. Ask. I want to increase Noah's time here, not less, more. Structured, predictable, but more. If he's somewhere Korshak's people know is heavily watched, somewhere with a police detective already circling and my own men doubled around the block, it becomes a harder target rather than an easier one. Your diner, ordinary as it looks from the street, would become one of the most protected places in this part of the city. You're asking me to turn Bell's Diner into a fortress. I'm asking you to let it become one without you having to lift a finger to build it, Victor said. The lifting, I'll do. I'm only asking you to keep doing exactly what you've already been doing. Feeding him, teaching him terrible dance moves, being the one unguarded, ordinary thing in his week that none of this has managed to touch yet. Grace looked past him, out through the window toward the darkened lot, where, she now understood, there had likely been an unmarked car watching this exact conversation the entire time, and she thought about a boy who laughed like joy still surprised him, and a father who flinched at the mention of a wife he never talked about, and a detective's plain white card sitting in her apron pocket like a small cold weight. Okay, she said. Victor looked almost startled by how quickly the word came, like he'd braced for a longer negotiation and hadn't accounted for how simply she'd hand it over. Okay, she said again, steadier now, but I want something in return. Not money. I already told you I don't want your money. Then what? The truth about his mother, Grace said. Not all of it. I'm not asking you to hand me your whole life on a coffee-stained counter. But that boy flinches every time her name almost comes up, and you flinch worse than he does. And I am not going to keep dancing with a kid who's carrying a grief nobody's ever explained to him properly. If I'm going to be part of protecting him, I need to understand what I'm protecting him from on the inside, not just the outside." Victor was silent for a long time, long enough that Sal, over by the door, shifted his weight uneasily, clearly unused to seeing his employer caught without an immediate answer. "That's a harder thing to give you than money," Victor said finally. "I know," Grace said. "That's why I'm asking for it instead." Victor told her the truth 3 nights later, after closing, when the chairs were already stacked on the tables, and the only light left burning was the one over the counter, where they sat across from each other like two people negotiating something far more delicate than a business arrangement. "Her name was Elena," he said. "You already know that much. I know that much. She wasn't like me. That's the first thing you should understand. She grew up 2 streets over from where I did, but somehow the same neighborhood raised 2 completely different people. I got into this life because my father was already in it, before I had a choice in the matter. She stayed as far from it as she could for as long as she could, and married me anyway, because apparently people fall in love with exactly the wrong things sometimes, and there isn't a great deal of logic in it." Grace said nothing, letting the silence hold the space he needed to keep going. She knew what I was when she married me. She told herself she could live beside it, without it touching her, without it touching any children we had. For a few years, that was almost true. I kept my work as far from our house as I could manage. Noah grew up thinking his father ran a shipping company, because for most of his early life, that was close enough to the truth that it didn't feel like a lie. What changed? Victor's jaw tightened. Korshak started making moves 2 years ago. Slow at first, testing which of my routes he could bleed without retaliation, then bolder, once he realized I preferred quiet solutions to loud ones. Elena started noticing things. Men she didn't recognize showing up at odd hours. Conversations that stopped the moment she walked into a room. She was smarter than I gave her credit for, and eventually she put enough of it together to understand exactly how much danger had been living under our roof the entire time, dressed up as an ordinary family. He stopped there, and Grace watched something move behind his eyes, old and unhealed. She wanted to leave, not because she stopped loving either of us, because she understood, better than I did at the time, that staying meant Noah growing up as a target the same way I had. She begged me to let her take him somewhere safe, somewhere with a different last name, somewhere Korshak's people would never think to look. "And you said no," Grace said quietly, already guessing the shape of it. "I said no." Victor's voice had gone very flat, very controlled, the voice of a man handling something so heavy that any looseness in his grip would shatter it completely. "I told myself I could protect them both without breaking the family apart. I told myself walking away from my own son was a worse danger than staying and fighting for him. I was wrong, and by the time I understood how wrong, it was already too late to undo the decision." "What happened to her?" "Korshak found out she wanted to leave before I did anything to help her do it safely. He saw an opportunity, not to hurt her directly. Even a man like him understood that would have brought a war he wasn't ready to survive. Instead, he made sure she believed, completely and convincingly, that staying meant losing everything, including the son she was trying to protect, and that leaving alone, quietly, without warning either of us, was the only way to keep Noah out of the crossfire permanently." Grace felt the shape of the story arriving before he said the rest of it, and something in her chest ached in anticipation. "She left in the middle of the night 2 years ago," Victor said. "She left a letter. She told Noah, in that letter, that she loved him more than anything in the world, and that leaving was the only way to keep him safe. She never told him it wasn't really her choice. She never got the chance to tell either of us anything else, because 3 weeks later, Korshak's people made sure she couldn't." The words landed in the empty diner like something physical, and Grace found she couldn't speak for a long moment. "He didn't kill her outright," Victor continued, voice barely above a whisper now. "He didn't need to. He simply made certain she disappeared so thoroughly that finding her became impossible, and let me spend 2 years not knowing whether my own wife was alive somewhere, hating me for driving her away, or gone completely and beyond any reach I had left. Either answer serves his purposes. Either answer keeps me distracted, guilty, weaker than I'd otherwise be. Does Noah know any of this? Noah knows his mother left a letter saying she loved him and that she had to go. That's all he knows, and that's all I've let him carry. Because a 7-year-old shouldn't have to hold the weight of what actually happened, not until he's old enough that the weight won't crush him. Victor looked up at her finally, and his eyes were raw in a way she hadn't seen from him before, not even the night his son had almost been taken. That's why the dancing mattered so much. The first time I saw it through your window. His mother used to dance with him in the kitchen on Sunday mornings before any of this started. I hadn't seen him do it since she left. I hadn't seen him laugh like that in 2 years, and then I walked past a diner one Tuesday evening, and there he was, laughing, dancing badly in the aisle with a stranger who had no idea what she was giving him back. Grace's throat tightened. I didn't know. You couldn't have known. That's exactly why it mattered. You gave it to him without trying to fix anything, without trying to heal a wound you didn't even know existed. You just made a lonely kid laugh on a slow Tuesday, and it turned out to be the most important thing anyone had done for him in 2 years. They sat in silence for a while after that, the fluorescent hum of the counter light the only sound in the room, and Grace found herself looking at this man differently than she had an hour before, not less afraid of what he was capable of, but understanding for the first time that fear and grief could occupy the exact same person without canceling each other out. I need you to understand something else, Victor said eventually, his voice returning to something steadier, more careful. Now that you know this, Korshak becomes more dangerous to you too, not less. A man who is willing to disappear my wife to control me will not hesitate to use anyone I've come to depend on. If you want to walk away from all of this tonight, from Noah, from me, from whatever this diner has become, I will understand completely, and I will make sure it's done safely and quietly, and you are never touched by any of it again. Grace thought about the offer for exactly as long as it took her to look toward the darkened window booth where a 7-year-old had spent months of Tuesdays waiting for someone to notice him, and she found she already knew her answer before Victor had finished offering it. I'm not walking away, she said. You should think about it longer than that. I've been thinking about it since the night that car showed up outside my window, Grace said. I've had weeks. I'm not choosing this because I don't understand the danger, Victor. I'm choosing it because I understand exactly what happens to that boy if everyone who's ever made him feel safe decides the risk is too much to carry. His mother left, whether she wanted to or not. I'm not going to be one more person who disappears out of his life because staying got complicated. Something moved across Victor's face then, something that looked almost like the beginning of hope, quickly suppressed, like a man who had trained himself not to trust good things arriving without a cost attached. There's a cost to this, he said quietly. There will be a cost. Korshak doesn't stop recalculating just because his first 3 attempts failed. If anything, he'll escalate, because failure makes men like him impatient, and impatient men make larger, riskier moves. Then we get ready for the larger move, Grace said, instead of hoping it doesn't come. Victor studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, something that could genuinely be called a smile crossed his face, small, tired, real. You realize you're negotiating security strategy with a man who runs half the shipping routes on this side of the city. I'm negotiating with the father of a kid who likes bad dance moves and extra fries, Grace said. The shipping routes are your problem. Noah's the part I actually care about. Victor's smile faded into something more serious, but no less warm. Then let's make sure Korshak never gets the chance to find out how much either of us cares. 2 nights later, the second attempt came, and this time it wasn't a car parked outside with its lights off. It was a man in a delivery uniform, carrying a box addressed to the diner that nobody had ordered, walking calmly through the front door during the dinner rush, while Sal's men, positioned exactly where Victor had promised they would be, clocked the mismatch in his gait before he'd made it 3 steps past the threshold. A delivery driver, who didn't check his clipboard, didn't glance at the address twice, and whose eyes went straight to the booth where Noah sat, instead of scanning for a name on a package. Sal was across the room before Grace had even registered the danger fully forming, moving with a speed that didn't match his broad, unhurried frame, and the box hit the floor as 2 of Victor's men closed around the stranger without a single customer in the diner, fully understanding what had almost happened in front of them. Noah, to his credit, didn't scream. He looked at Grace instead, the way he had learned to over the past weeks, checking her face for the size of the danger before deciding how frightened to be. And Grace, heart slamming against her ribs, forced her voice steady and her hands steadier as she said the same 4 words she'd used the very first night all this began. "You're okay. I've got you." The stranger was gone within minutes, taken quietly out the back by men who didn't explain where he was going, and didn't need to, and the diner's remaining customers were told, with practiced calm, that it had been a mix-up with a delivery, nothing more. Please enjoy your meal. It wasn't until much later, after Victor had arrived white-faced and furious, and had held his son longer than strictly necessary in the back office, that Grace allowed herself to shake, alone in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles matched the porcelain. Korshak wasn't testing anymore. He was done recalculating, and whatever came next, Grace understood with a cold and total certainty, would not arrive quietly. The call came in at 4 in the morning, and Grace was awake for it in a way that felt less like waking and more like a switch being thrown. "Get dressed," Victor said. No greeting, no softness, just the flat, urgent tone of a man who had already made every decision he needed to make and was only now informing the people affected by it. "I'm sending a car. Nadia's diner is being watched by 2 of Korshak's men on the street outside right now, and I need you somewhere safer until this is finished." "Finished how?" Grace asked, already pulling on her coat with the phone wedged against her shoulder. "Korshak sent word an hour ago. He wants a meeting. Neutral ground. His terms. Tonight. He says he's tired of failed attempts and wants to negotiate directly instead." Victor's voice was tight, controlled, the sound of a man holding something enormous, very carefully so it didn't spill. "I don't trust a single word of it, but if I refuse, he escalates again, and I am done letting Noah be a card he gets to keep playing. You're not going alone. I'm not planning to." The car arrived 12 minutes later, Sal at the wheel, jaw set, eyes scanning every parked vehicle on the street, like each one might be hiding something. Grace climbed in and found Victor already inside, Noah beside him wrapped in a blanket, half asleep, clutching a stuffed animal Grace had never once seen him carry in all the months she'd known him. "Why is he with us?" Grace asked quietly, alarmed. "Because the safest place for him tonight is somewhere Korshak's people don't expect us to be, and every safe house I own is a location Korshak has had months to map," Victor said, low, so as not to wake his son further. "We're going somewhere he's never thought to look. Somewhere ordinary. Somewhere that doesn't appear on a single ledger tied to my name." Grace understood before he finished the sentence. "The diner. The diner," Victor confirmed. "Nadia's already been called. She's meeting us there. It stays open, lights on, business as usual, 3 in the morning or not, and if anyone asks, it's a private event. Meanwhile, Sal takes me to the meeting Korshak requested, and you and Noah stay exactly where nobody would ever think to search for the son of a man like me. You're using my diner as a hiding place while you walk into a trap. I'm using the one place in this city that's already proven it can keep my son calm during the worst nights of his life," Victor said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, just enough for her to hear the fear underneath the composure. "I don't know what happens at that meeting tonight, Grace. I know I have to go, because refusing guarantees he keeps coming after Noah forever, and going gives me at least a chance of ending it. But I need to know, whatever happens to me tonight, that my son is somewhere safe, with someone who has already proven she'd stand between him and a car with its headlights off without knowing what she was standing in front of. Grace reached across the seat and took his hand, just for a moment, just long enough to steady them both. "Then go end it," she said. "I've got him." Bell's Diner at 4 in the morning looked strange and unfamiliar, all its lights blazing against the dark street outside, chairs still up on some of the tables where Nadia hadn't finished closing before the phone call pulled her back in. 2 of Victor's men took positions outside without being told twice, and Nadia poured coffee nobody was drinking, just to have something to do with her hands. Noah woke fully, somewhere around the 3rd hour, disoriented, reaching immediately for his father before remembering his father wasn't there. "He'll be back," Grace said, before the boy's face could fully collapse into the fear building behind his eyes. "He went to go finish something, so nobody ever has to send a strange car to pick you up again. That's what tonight is. It's the last one." "How do you know?" Noah asked, small, and Grace, who did not actually know anything of the kind, made a decision in that moment about what kind of truth a frightened 7-year-old needed most. "Because your dad doesn't lose," she said. "I've seen him with you. A man who loves someone that much doesn't walk into a fight without a plan to win it." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a bet, placed on the only evidence she had, the way Victor Marchetti had knelt on a diner floor the first night they'd met and held his son like the world had almost ended, and the way he'd looked at her 3 nights ago and admitted, in the emptied-out quiet of this same diner, everything it had cost him to keep his son safe up to now. She turned the jukebox on, low, just to give the silence somewhere to go, and when a slow song came drifting out into the fluorescent-lit dark, she held out her hand. "Come on," she said. "One more dance while we wait." Noah looked at her hand for a long moment, then took it, and they moved slowly between the counter and the pie case the way they had that very first Tuesday months ago. Badly, unpracticed, entirely unconcerned with looking graceful, and for a few minutes the fear in the room thinned out just enough for a tired boy to remember what safety was supposed to feel like. They were still dancing, slow and half asleep on Noah's part, when headlights swept across the diner windows just past dawn. Grace's whole body went rigid before she recognized the shape of the car, and then Sal was through the door first, and behind him, Victor, tie gone, coat torn at one shoulder, a bruise already darkening along his jaw, but upright, breathing, alive, and alone in the sense that mattered most. No one from Korshak's side had come with him. Noah broke away from Grace and ran, the same unrestrained sprint from that very first night, and Victor caught him, knelt, held him, and this time when he looked up over his son's shoulder, there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not just relief, something closer to the exhausted, disbelieving calm of a man who had been carrying an enormous weight for 2 years and had only just, this morning, set part of it down. "Is it over?" Grace asked quietly. "Korshak's operation collapsed an hour ago," Victor said, still holding Noah, his voice rough. "Not the way you're imagining. No one is dead, no one that shouldn't be. He miscalculated one final time. He thought I'd come to that meeting to negotiate, and instead I came with proof, evidence I'd spent months quietly gathering through channels even my own men didn't fully know about, enough to hand a certain detective everything he needed to move against Korshak's entire operation without ever tracing a single piece of it back to me. Korshak is in custody as we speak. His people are already scattering, looking for new employers, because a leader who gets caught stops being worth following." Grace felt something in her chest unclench that she hadn't fully realized was clenched. "Doyle. Detective Doyle has been building a case against Korshak for over a year," Victor said. "He needed evidence he couldn't get on his own. I needed Korshak gone without a war that would have put Noah in more danger, not less. It turns out a dangerous man and an honest cop can occasionally want the exact same outcome, even if we'd never admit to liking each other. So it's really finished. The immediate threat, yes." Victor stood, keeping one hand resting on his son's shoulder, the same protective habit she'd watched him wear, like a second coat for months now. I won't pretend the rest of it disappears overnight. I am still what I am, Grace. That doesn't change because one dangerous man went to prison this morning. But the specific danger that put my son in a stranger's car outside your window, that's over. Truly over. Grace looked at Noah, awake now, alert, watching the adults talk with the particular focus of a child gauging whether the news was good or bad, and she smiled at him before he had to ask. "Your dad won," she said. "Told you." Noah's face broke into something unguarded and enormous, the biggest smile Grace had seen on him in all the months she'd known him, and he threw his arms around her waist without warning, quick and fierce, before darting back to his father's side like the show of affection had embarrassed him slightly after the fact. The weeks that followed were quieter than any Grace could remember since the whole strange chapter of her life had begun. The unmarked second car still trailed Noah's usual rides for a while longer, out of habit more than necessity, until eventually even that faded away, replaced by nothing more dramatic than Sal, driving the same route he always had, whistling sometimes under his breath, the way men do when a long-held tension has finally, fully let go. Victor kept coming to the diner, though the reasons shifted subtly over time, from watching his son eat, to simply being there, sitting across the counter from Grace during the slow hours, coffee going cold in front of him the way it always had, except now he sometimes actually finished it. Nadia noticed before Grace was ready to admit it to herself. "You're not just doing this for the boy anymore," she said one evening, wiping down the counter with the particular knowing look of a woman who had run a diner long enough to read every kind of customer that walked through her door. "I don't know what I'm doing," Grace admitted. "I think you do," Nadia said. "You've just gotten used to not saying it out loud." Grace didn't argue. Months later, on a Sunday that used to belong to nothing but empty booths and slow refills, the diner filled instead with something it had never quite held before, a father and son sitting together in the booth by the window that used to hold one lonely boy eating alone, both of them laughing at something Grace couldn't quite hear from behind the counter, and a black car parked outside that no longer idled with its lights off like a threat, but sat quietly, patiently, like something that had finally learned how to simply wait for a family instead of hunting one. Noah still used the same name for her he'd started using months ago, the informal one, dropped in the middle of sentences without ceremony, like she'd always belonged in his life, rather than having arrived in the middle of it. He still asked her to dance on slow nights, though he'd gotten slightly better at it, though not by much, and Grace still let him lead badly through the narrow aisle between the counter and the pie case, because some things, she'd learned, were worth keeping exactly as imperfect and unpolished as they'd always been. Victor stopped by most Sundays now, no longer waiting in any car at all, walking straight through the front door, like a man who had finally decided this particular room was safe enough to belong in without reservation. He still carried the weight of who he was outside these four walls, the shipping routes and the quiet arrangements, and the reputation that would follow him regardless of how many mornings he spent in a diner booth with his son. Grace had stopped expecting him to set that weight down completely. She'd learned, instead, that some people simply carry their history alongside their present, one in each hand, and the best you can do for them is make sure the present hand has something worth holding. On the last Sunday of that particular season, with the diner half full and the jukebox playing something slow and a little out of style, Victor watched his son twirl clumsily under Grace's raised arm, laughing in that same short, surprised bark he'd had since the very beginning, like joy was still occasionally catching him off guard, still occasionally arriving as a pleasant shock rather than an expectation. "He hasn't stopped laughing like that in months," Victor said quietly, watching them. "Good," Grace said. "He shouldn't have to." "Neither should you," Victor said, and when she looked over at him, there was something steady and unhurried in his expression, the look of a man who had spent 2 years bracing for loss and was only now, carefully, beginning to let himself believe in something staying instead. Grace didn't answer with words. She simply held out her free hand toward him, the same way she had toward his son months earlier, on a night neither of them could have known would change everything, and after a moment's hesitation, the hesitation of a man unused to being asked rather than asking, Victor took it. They didn't dance well either. Neither of them cared. Outside, the black car sat quiet at the curb, headlights off, engine still, no longer a threat waiting to happen but simply a car belonging to a family that had finally, after everything, found somewhere safe enough to stay.